Her mother-in-law humiliated her in front of the entire high society by throwing red wine all over her white dress. But none of them imagined that this public shame would ignite the fall of their powerful family. Stay with me until the end to see how Lucía turns humiliation, betrayal, and a brutal custody battle into a new life that helps dozens of other women break free. The elegant music of the string quartet resonated softly in the luxurious hall of the Grand Regency Hotel in California. The air was permeated with a subtle aroma of red wine and fresh flowers, while the most influential women of high society conversed with rehearsed smiles and glasses in hand. The night was dedicated to a noble cause, a charity gala in support of women in vulnerable situations. Pure irony, because the main organizer of that event, Lucía Alvarez, was living exactly the same situation she was trying to combat. Lucía wore an elegant floor-length white silk dress with a discreet but sophisticated neckline. She had spent weeks planning every detail of that night, from the menu selection to the seating arrangement. Everything was designed to be a success, and it was, at least until that moment. From the other end of the room, Doña Esperanza, her mother-in-law, watched her with an expression of barely concealed contempt. At her side, her son Carlos, Lucía's husband, calmly sipped his whiskey, showing no interest in what was happening around him. "Lucía, dear," Doña Esperanza's voice broke the murmur of conversation, drawing the attention of several people around her. "Come here. I need to talk to you." Lucía, who was attending to some guests, felt a chill run down her spine. She knew that something bad was about to happen. With a forced smile, she walked over to her mother-in-law, feeling the curious glances of several women who already sensed the conflict. "Yes, mother-in-law," she asked politely. Doña Esperanza held a glass of red wine in her hand, swirling the liquid delicately before fixing her cold gaze on Lucía. "I've always found you curious. How do you manage to fool so many people here? Everyone sees you as an exemplary woman, but in reality, you're just a poor, deluded woman who has no idea how the world works." Lucía felt a knot in her stomach. It wasn't the first time her mother-in-law had attacked her, but she had never done so in such a public manner. "I don't understand what you mean, ma'am." Doña Esperanza's smile twisted into a sneer. Then, with a quick movement, she tilted her glass of red wine and spilled it completely over Lucía's impeccable white dress. The crimson liquid soaked the fabric as if it were blood, staining her torso and sliding down her waist to the floor. A stifled gasp escaped Lucía's lips as the sticky heat of the wine clung to her skin. Silence fell immediately over the room. For a moment, no one reacted. Everyone watched with wide eyes, waiting for Lucía's response. But before she could say anything, Carlos broke the tension with a laugh. "Don't be dramatic, love," he exclaimed mockingly as he took a sip of his whiskey. "It's just a little wine. You're not going to die." Lucía turned to look at him in disbelief. Not only was her husband not defending her, but he was laughing at her humiliation. His own flesh and blood was mocking her along with her mother, Doña Esperanza. She crossed her arms with an expression of pure satisfaction. "You look ridiculous, girl, but you know what's worse." She leaned a little closer to her, close enough for Lucía to feel her breath, heavy with expensive perfume. "You've never been good enough for my son. We've only tolerated you because it suits us for you to be the face of our charity events." The words hit her harder than the wine dripping down her body. Each letter was a direct stab at her dignity. She looked around at the faces of the women who had once admired her. Some looked uncomfortable. Others could barely hide their morbid amusement. The heat in her chest wasn't just from the wine. It was anger, shame, pain. 5 years of marriage, 5 years of trying to be the perfect wife, of humiliation, of pretending that her marriage was happy. "Why are they doing this to me?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but her gaze was fixed on Carlos, waiting, hoping he would say something. But Carlos just shook his head, amused. "Don't exaggerate, Lucía. Always so sensitive. My mother is just joking." Her voice trembled. "Yes, but of course you always play the victim. For God's sake, it's just wine." Doña Esperanza smiled superiorly, patting her son on the back as if he were a well-behaved child. "I've always said that men should be patient with their wives, especially when they are as emotionally fragile as Lucía. A murmur ran through the room. The humiliation was no longer just a feeling inside her. It was real, tangible. She stood there, soaked in wine, while her husband and mother-in-law mocked her in front of all of California's elite. Lucía felt as if she couldn't breathe. Her heart pounded, not with sadness, but from something she had never felt so intensely before: hatred. With clenched fists, she forced herself to breathe deeply. She wasn't going to cry in front of them. She wasn't going to give them that pleasure. "Excuse me," she said, her voice firmer than she had expected. She turned without waiting for a response and walked away with her head held high, leaving behind the stifled laughter and whispers. But something inside her broke that night, because as she climbed the stairs of the hotel to lock herself in the bathroom and try to clean up the mess on her dress, she understood that there was nothing left to save in her marriage. What she didn't know yet was that this public humiliation would be the beginning of her rebirth. The Alvarez mansion was silent. There was no trace of the chaos of that night's event, or the mocking laughter of Carlos and Doña Esperanza. All that remained was the echo of Lucía's footsteps on the marble floor and the suffocating weight of the humiliation that still burned in her chest. She had tried to sleep, but couldn't. She had tried to cry, but had no tears left. Lying in the huge double bed, staring at the ceiling, her skin still sticky from the wine she hadn't been able to wash off completely, Lucía felt only emptiness, an abyss of pain and shame that seemed bottomless. Carlos wasn't home, which didn't surprise her. He never cared about her. He hadn't even sent her a message after the scandal her mother had caused for him. Tonight meant nothing to him. She closed her eyes, but her mind kept repeating everything: the laughter, the pitying looks from some of the women, the ruined white dress, the cruel voice of Doña Esperanza piercing her ears. "You were never good enough for my son." Lucía clenched her fists. 5 years of putting up with this. 5 years of feeling like a stranger in her own marriage, like a decorative accessory for Carlos's family. She picked up her cell phone from the nightstand, trying to distract herself with anything. She opened her photo gallery, where there were pictures from when she still believed in her marriage: the wedding, the honeymoon, the early years with Valeria. In some of them, Carlos looked at her with love, or so she thought, because now that she looked closely at those photos, she noticed something else: disinterest. Carlos never hugged her with real emotion. He never held her gaze for too long. Maybe the love she thought existed was never there. Maybe it was always a lie. Just then, the cell phone vibrated in her hand. Lucía blinked. It was a message from an unknown number. She frowned and unlocked the screen. There was no text, just a video. She felt a chill. Her first impulse was to ignore it, thinking it was a mistake, but something in her chest told her she had to watch it. An intuition, a premonition. With a trembling thumb, she pressed play. The cell phone screen lit up with the image of a luxury hotel. She recognized the place, the Hilton, California Midtown. Lucía's heart began to beat fast. The shaky camera approached the entrance to a suite. The door was ajar, and inside, warm lights illuminated a room with silk sheets. And then she saw him. Carlos. Her husband was in bed, half naked, with a blonde woman on top of him. She stopped breathing. In the video, Carlos was laughing, holding the woman by the waist. She whispered something in his ear and then kissed him. A deep, intimate kiss. The kind of kiss Lucía hadn't received in years. Her whole body froze. Her head was spinning. The video continued. Carlos turned in bed, getting on top of the woman, kissing her neck and down her chest. Lucía felt the video stop. Lucía stared at the screen, unable to move. 1 second. 2, 3. Suddenly, she felt short of breath. Her vision blurred, and a sharp pain shot through her chest. She whispered, "No," but her own voice sounded distant, as if it didn't belong to her. It couldn't be. Not after everything she had given to this marriage. Not after 5 years of humiliation, sacrifice, and trying to be enough. But there was the proof on her cell phone screen, shining like a death sentence. Carlos had not only publicly humiliated her that night, he had also gone to bed with another woman. How many more times had he done it, without her knowing? Lucía dropped her cell phone on the bed and brought both hands to her mouth, trying to contain a heart-wrenching sob. The pain was unbearable. She doubled over, feeling her heart break into 1,000 pieces inside her chest. Her throat burned, her eyes burned, her soul burned. But amid the anguish, the crying, the betrayal, something else began to well up inside her. Rage. A fire she had never felt before began to ignite in the depths of her being. Carlos had mocked her once again. He had laughed at her dignity. He had trampled on her love, her trust, her devotion, but no more. It was over. She got out of bed abruptly, wiping her tears violently. She wasn't going to stay in that house a second longer. She went to the closet and took out a suitcase. She took only the essentials: her passport, some cash, enough clothes for a few days. She didn't take any mementos. She crossed the hall to Valeria's room. Her little girl was sleeping peacefully with her teddy bear in her arms. Lucía felt a lump in her throat. Valeria deserved better than this hell. She leaned over and stroked her hair. "My love, wake up." The girl stirred under the covers and opened her eyes with difficulty. "Mommy, what's going on? Are we leaving right now?" Valeria looked at her innocently. "Where?" Lucía swallowed hard. She didn't have an answer. The only thing she knew was that they couldn't stay in a place where no one would hurt them. Valeria felt too tired to ask questions. Lucía carried her in her arms with her daughter's backpack on her shoulder. She felt her chest explode with adrenaline. She didn't look back. She went down the stairs with silent steps, praying that no one would wake up. Every creak of the floor was a shot of panic. She opened the front door and felt the cool, early morning air hit her face. She was free, but fear still haunted her. She hurried to the street and raised her hand to hail a taxi. "Before we go on, put yourself in Lucía's place for a second. Would you have walked away too, or confronted them right there? Tell me in the comments what you would have done." The car stopped. The driver rolled down the window with a sleepy expression. "Where to, ma'am?" Lucía took a deep breath. She didn't have a plan. She only had one certainty. She would never again allow herself to be trampled on. She hugged Valeria tightly and then said, "Take me as far away as possible." The taxi drove away from the mansion of betrayal, from hell. Lucía didn't know what awaited her on the other side, but she was ready to find out. She had begun her rebirth. The cold early morning breeze blew in through the taxi window, but Lucía hardly felt it with Valeria asleep in her lap, her little head resting on her chest. She looked out the window without really seeing anything. The city lights passed by like blurry flashes as the vehicle moved forward in the darkness. Her life had changed forever. She was carrying only a suitcase with the essentials and a few bills in her wallet. She didn't know exactly where to go, only that she couldn't go back. She held Valeria close to her chest, feeling the little girl breathe softly, oblivious to everything that was happening. She didn't deserve this. She deserved a stable home, security, love, everything that Carlos had denied her. Lucía closed her eyes, and for a moment, her mind betrayed her. She remembered the past. 5 years ago, Carlos looked at her with a charming smile as he held the restaurant door open for her. He was always so attentive. "Ladies first," he said in his warm voice, bowing slightly in a gentlemanly gesture. Lucía laughed softly and entered. She had never met a man so thoughtful, so confident, so protective. Everything about him was perfect. The way he spoke, his natural elegance, the way he always made her feel special. "You are the most beautiful woman I have ever seen," Lucía had told him one night when they had only been together for 3 months. And she, innocently in love, believed him. She believed every promise, every, "I'll always take care of you," every, "You are my world." She didn't see the signs. She didn't see how Carlos gradually began to mold her to his liking. First, there were small comments. "Are you going out in that dress? I think you'd look better in something less flashy." Then there were subtleties disguised as concern. "That friend of yours, I don't know. I don't like him. Good vibes. Why don't you spend more time with me instead of going out with him?" Later, prohibitions disguised as love. "I don't like you working so much. You don't need to. I'll give you everything you want." And before she knew it, she was no longer Lucía. She was Carlos Alvarez's wife, just another ornament in his life. Lucía opened her eyes with a start. The taxi stopped with a slight screech. "We're here, ma'am." She blinked, returning to the present. She was no longer with Carlos. She was no longer his wife. Now she was in California and had to start from scratch. The New Hope Women's Center was a modest building with a simple facade and a white gate at the entrance. It was not a hotel or a luxury apartment, but at that moment, it was all Lucía had. A woman in her 50s with her hair pulled back and a kind expression welcomed her. "How can we help you?" Lucía swallowed saliva. She wasn't used to asking for help. She had always been the perfect wife, the one with an impeccable life in the eyes of the world. But now she had nothing. "I need a place to stay with my daughter." The woman gave her an understanding look. She wasn't the first or the last woman to arrive. "You can stay as long as you need." Lucía felt a lump in her throat. For the first time in a long time, someone was offering her help without asking for anything in return. The next morning, she went out to look for work. She had woken up with a determination she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't going to give up, but the first few hours were devastating. "I'm sorry, we're not hiring. We don't have any vacancies at the moment. We're looking for someone with experience. A resume. Oh yes, we'll call you." But no one called. With every door that was closed, her desperation grew. She needed money. Evening was falling when she passed in front of a neighborhood taco restaurant with an irresistible aroma of grilled meat and freshly made tortillas. Above the entrance was a red and white sign that read, "Taquería El Buen Sabor se busca ayudante." Taco restaurant, good taste, seeks assistant. Lucía took a deep breath and went inside. Behind the counter, a man in his mid-50s with a stained apron and a black cap was cooking with skill. He had a simple air about him, but his face reflected experience and character. "Good afternoon," said Lucía, feeling awkward. The man turned and looked at her curiously. "How can I help you?" Lucía swallowed. "I saw the ad. I'm looking for work. I can do anything. Cleaning, waiting tables, helping in the kitchen. I'm a quick learner." The man raised an eyebrow. "Do you have experience in taquerias? Not in restaurants?" "No." The man sighed and crossed his arms. "Look, the truth is, I need someone who knows how to move around in the kitchen. Things move fast here." Lucía felt a knot in her stomach. "The same thing again, please. I'll do anything." The man looked at her silently for a few seconds, then sighed. "All right, a trial period. 1 week. If you can't keep up, you're out." Lucía lied immediately. It didn't matter how hard it was. She had no choice. The first day was hell. Lucía wasn't used to standing for hours, moving quickly, enduring the heat of the kitchen. Her feet, back, and hands hurt. But she didn't give up. And then something curious happened. One day, while cleaning the kitchen, she saw a sack of flour and remembered something. The afternoons with her grandmother baking sweet bread in the kitchen of her childhood. Without thinking too much about it, she took some ingredients and baked a small batch of butter cookies. When Andrés, the owner of the taqueria, tasted them, he frowned. "You made these?" Lucía looked down, unsure. "Yes, I just wanted to try." He was silent for a moment, then smiled. "They're delicious." And so, without meaning to, without expecting it, Lucía found something of her own, something that no one could take away from her. She didn't know it yet, but those cookies would be the beginning of her new life. Before continuing, we want to know more about you. Where are you listening from? Leave us a comment with the name of your city or country. We'd love to know how far our stories are reaching. The smell of freshly baked dough filled the small kitchen of the taqueria. Lucía, wearing an apron stained with flour, took a tray of golden cookies out of the oven. It was the first moment of peace she had felt in weeks. For the first time in a long time, she felt useful. She felt capable. Valeria played with plastic cutlery at a table in the back while Lucía worked. The little girl laughed to herself, talking to her dolls, oblivious to all the hell they had escaped. Lucía watched her with a mixture of tenderness and sadness. She was doing all this for her, but the calm was short-lived. The sound of the phone interrupted the peaceful atmosphere. Andrés, the owner of the taqueria, answered it in his usual relaxed tone. "Hello?" A silence. Lucía was still focused on her cookies. She didn't pay attention, until she saw Andrés's face harden. "She's busy, ma'am." "Who's speaking?" Lucía looked up. "Tell her she can't hide forever." The voice on the other end of the phone was unmistakable. Cold, arrogant, pure venom. Lucía felt a chill. Doña Esperanza. Andres looked at her with concern and lowered the receiver, covering the microphone with his hand. It's for you. Lucía wanted to run, wanted to hang up, but she knew that if she didn't face this now, things would only get worse. She picked up the phone with cold fingers. Doña Esperanza's dry laughter could be heard on the other end of the line. Well, well, look at that, the poor little woman. Now she's playing at being independent. Lucía clenched her teeth. I have nothing to say to you. Oh, but you do, dear, because you dared to do something unforgivable. The tone of her voice changed from mockery to threat. You stole my granddaughter. Lucía felt her stomach sink. I didn't steal her. She's my daughter. She was my granddaughter until you decided to run away like a coward in the middle of the night. Lucía swallowed hard, clutching the receiver tightly. I left because your son is a damn cheater, and you treated me worse than a servant. Oh, Lucía. Doña Esperanza's tone was almost condescending, always so melodramatic. There was a tense silence. Let me be clear with you. Her voice dropped a tone, becoming darker, sharper. If you don't, you return with Valeria within the next 24 hours. I swear to God you'll regret it. Lucía felt a cold sweat run down her back. You have no right to tell me what to do. I don't need rights, dear. I need contacts, and I have plenty of those. Lucía knew at that moment that she was in danger. But before she could answer the call, it cut off. She stood there with the phone in her hand, feeling anxiety close her throat. Her peace of mind had evaporated. Andres looked at her with a frown. Who was it? Lucía took a deep breath and looked at him with fear in her eyes. They're coming for Valeria. Lucía spent the night awake. Every shadow outside the taqueria made her jump. Every noise in the street terrified her. She closed the door of the small room Andres had lent her in the back of the business and hugged Valeria. They weren't going to separate them. She wasn't going to let them take her away. But she knew that Doña Esperanza never made empty threats, and she found out the next day. As soon as the sun came up, there was a loud knock at the door. Lucía jumped up, her heart pounding in her chest. Police! Open the door, ma'am! Her world fell apart. She staggered to the entrance, and when she opened the door, 3 officers were standing there. Behind them was a man in a black suit with a briefcase in his hand. A lawyer. Lucía Alvarez, right? Asked the officer in a serious tone. Lucía could barely nod. We have received a complaint against you for kidnapping a minor. The air left her lungs. What? The lawyer intervened coldly. The Alvarez family has filed a lawsuit to regain custody of the minor Valeria Alvarez. Lucía felt her legs give way. I am her mother. I did not kidnap her. You will have to explain that in court. Lucía looked down the street, and her heart stopped. A black car was parked there, and inside, sitting with her usual cruel elegance, Doña Esperanza watched her with a slight smile of satisfaction, like a cat enjoying the suffering of a mouse. Trapped, you bastards, Lucía muttered, her hands trembling. The lawyer continued speaking indifferently. Given that you have no steady job or stable residence, the judge will evaluate the situation. Lucía could barely process what she was hearing, but she knew that if Valeria was with her, she was fine. She didn't want to live with them. The lawyer ignored her plea. You must appear in court in 3 days. Until then, the girl will remain in your care, but the legal process for her return has begun. Lucía felt panic suffocating her. She had no money for lawyers, no connections, and they knew it. Good luck, Mrs. Alvarez, said the lawyer before turning and leaving with the officers. Lucía couldn't move, but she could see Doña Esperanza. The woman in the car held her gaze and raised an eyebrow as if to say, I warned you. The car started and disappeared down the street. Lucía felt her strength leaving her. She leaned against the door, her body trembling. They were going to take her away. She had to do something, but she had no idea how to fight them. She had nothing, or at least that's what she thought, because what she didn't know yet was that fate was about to put the allies she needed to fight in her path, and this war was just beginning. Lucía spent the rest of the day in a state of shock. She couldn't eat. She couldn't think clearly. She couldn't breathe without feeling like the world was falling apart. Fear was a constant presence in her chest. Every beat of her heart was a reminder that they were about to take Valeria away from her. The girl, oblivious to the disaster looming over them, played with a piece of dough in the taqueria kitchen molding it. Lucía watched her in silence, feeling a pang of deep pain. How could a mother protect her daughter when the whole world was against her? The Alvarezes were powerful. They had money, lawyers, influence. She had nothing. You can't let them win. Lucía turned her head. Andrés was watching her from the kitchen doorway, his arms crossed and a serious expression on his face. It's not that easy. Her voice came out barely a whisper. It never is. But if you let yourself go, you've already lost. Lucía let out a trembling sigh. I have no way to fight them. I have no money, no house, no... You have talent? Lucía blinked in confusion. Andrés pointed to the tray of cookies she had baked that morning. This is worth more than you think. Lucía frowned. What are you talking about? Andrés leaned on the table and looked at her intently. I've watched you work these past few weeks. You came here knowing nothing about cooking, and you learned. But what you're really good at is baking. Lucía felt a shiver of nervousness. It's not enough. No. If you think like a victim, the words hit her hard. Andrés took a cookie from the tray and bit into it. If you want to fight those bastards, you need stability, and I need someone to take care of the sweet side of the business. If you're interested, we could be partners. Lucía looked at him in complete shock. You have a gift, Lucía. It's crazy not to take advantage of it, but I don't know anything about business, and I do. Lucía felt a mixture of excitement and fear. Why would you do this for me? Andrés smiled slightly. Because we all need help sometimes, and because I believe in you, even if you don't yet. Lucía felt a lump in her throat. For the first time in a long time, someone trusted her, but something important was still missing. The next blow was not long in coming. 2 days later, a yellow envelope arrived at the taqueria. Lucía opened it with trembling hands. It was the official notification of Carlos's lawsuit. He was requesting full custody of Valeria. Lucía felt the ground open up beneath her feet. The document said that she did not have sufficient income, that she did not have stable housing, that she could not offer her daughter a secure future. Everything it said was true. She felt despair take hold of her body. What am I going to do? Andrés took the document and reviewed it with a frown. You need a lawyer. Lucía let out a bitter laugh. How am I going to pay for that? Andrés did not respond. He just picked up the phone and dialed a number. Lucía looked at him, not understanding. Who are you calling? Someone who can help you. Lucía had no hope until the next day, when a woman entered the taqueria. Daniela Mendez had the presence of someone who was used to fighting. Her black hair was pulled back in a bun, her eyes were sharp as knives, and her dark blue suit was impeccable. Lucía knew immediately that this woman was not someone you would want to underestimate. Daniela sat down across from her and placed a folder on the table. I read your case. It's a... Lucía blinked, surprised by her frankness. Yes, Daniela sighed. Look, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Carlos and his mother have money and influence. They want to destroy you. They don't just want to take your daughter away from you. They want to see you ruined. Lucía felt a chill. So there's nothing I can do? Daniela looked at her sternly. Of course there is something we can do. Lucía shook her head. I don't have the money to pay a lawyer. Daniela rested her elbows on the table and interlaced her fingers. I'm not asking you for money. Lucía looked at her, bewildered. Why would you help me without charging me? Daniela smiled wryly. Because people like Carlos and his mother make me sick, and because I've seen too many women lose this battle. I'm not going to let you be another one. Lucía felt tears burning in her eyes for the first time in a long time. She wasn't alone. Things weren't resolved immediately. The war was just beginning. But now Lucía had allies, and for the first time in her life, she was preparing to fight. If you're rooting for Lucía to finally win this battle, tap the like button so more people can hear stories like hers. Lucía had never set foot in a courtroom in her life. When she entered the courthouse in California, she felt the air become heavier, as if the atmosphere were permeated with despair. The echo of her footsteps on the marble resounded in the enormous hallway, each sound louder than the last, a reminder that she was walking straight to her execution. Her hands were frozen, her breathing erratic. Fear was devouring her from within, but she had to do it for Valeria. She squeezed her daughter's little hand and gave her a forced smile. Everything will be fine, my love. The innocent girl nodded. She believed her mother, but she wasn't so sure. Daniela appeared at her side, dressed in a dark suit and with that hard expression that made her seem immune to everything. "Don't let them intimidate you," she whispered without looking at her. Lucía swallowed hard. How could she not be intimidated? As soon as they entered the courtroom, she saw Carlos and Doña Esperanza sitting on the other side of the room, both looking at her with pure contempt. Carlos, in his suit, his hair perfectly combed, and a false expression of concern on his face, as if he really cared about Valeria. Doña Esperanza, impeccable as always, held a rosary in her hands, as if the simple act of touching it made her a hypocritical saint. Lucía felt a wave of nausea. They sat down. The judge, an elderly man with thick glasses, entered, and the hearing began. Carlos's lawyer stood up, a tall, thin man with a measured and calculated tone of voice. "Your Honor, my client only wants what is best for his daughter, and unfortunately, Mrs. Lucía Alvarez cannot offer her a stable home." Lucía felt her blood run cold. The lawyer slid a document across the table. "Mrs. Alvarez does not have a permanent home. She lives in the back of a restaurant." Lucía looked down. It was true. She had no stable income, no property, no assets. "My client, on the other hand, has the necessary resources to give the girl a decent life." Lucía felt a twinge in her chest. The lawyer paused dramatically. "My client has evidence that Mrs. Alvarez has been in contact with individuals of dubious reputation," the lawyer said. Lucía frowned. What was he talking about? The lawyer turned the screen of a laptop toward the judge. There was a dramatic pause. Lucía frowned. What was he talking about? The lawyer turned the screen of a laptop toward the judge. Lucía felt the air leave her lungs. They were photos of her at the taco restaurant, talking to Andrés. Nothing out of the ordinary, but the lawyer manipulated the information with surgical precision. "Mr. Andrés Gutiérrez, with whom Mrs. Alvarez has a working relationship, has a history of street fights." Lucía felt a mixture of anger and despair. "That doesn't mean anything." The lawyer smiled smugly. "Maybe not to you, but what kind of mother exposes her daughter to that kind of people?" Lucía clenched her teeth. They didn't just want to take Valeria away from her. They wanted to destroy her. "This is a desperate attempt to discredit my client." Daniela stood with a firm, sharp voice. "There is no evidence that Mrs. Alvarez has endangered her daughter." The judge nodded slightly, but the smile on Carlos's lips told her that they were not done yet. Carlos's lawyer cleared his throat. "Your Honor, we also have testimony." Lucía frowned. "We want to call the witness, Doña Esperanza Alvarez." Lucía's stomach churned. Doña Esperanza stood up with a look of suffering on her face. What a performance. She approached the stand and placed her hand on the Bible. "I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth." Lucía felt rage boiling inside her. Lies. Everything that would come out of her mouth would be a lie. The lawyer approached her with a look of false compassion. "Mrs. Alvarez, could you tell us what the relationship between your daughter-in-law and your son is?" Doña Esperanza sighed with tears in her eyes. "I always tried to accept Lucía, but it was impossible. From the beginning, I knew she wasn't right for my son." Lucía closed her eyes for a second, trying to control her breathing. She was unstable, moody, and easily angered. Lie. Carlos always tried to make her happy, but she didn't appreciate it. Lie. And worst of all, "Your Honor, I fear for the well-being of my granddaughter." Lucía felt a punch in the stomach. Doña Esperanza pretended to wipe away a tear. "Lucía has always been emotionally unstable. I myself saw her yell at Valeria on several occasions." Lucía stood up suddenly. "That's a lie." The judge banged his gavel on the table. "Order in the court." Doña Esperanza looked down, as if she were too upset to continue speaking. Lucía wanted to scream. She wanted to cry. She wanted to hit something. Carlos looked at her with a slight smile. They were already winning, and Lucía felt defeated until Daniela passed her a piece of paper under the table. Lucía read it with a frown. "I have something." She turned her head to look at her. Daniela just nodded. Lucía swallowed. Something was about to change. Daniela stood up. "Your Honor, I request a recess." The judge nodded. Carlos and Doña Esperanza stood up with confidence, believing they had already won. But Lucía saw the look on Daniela's face and knew that the war was not over yet. "What do you have?" she whispered as soon as they left the room. Daniela handed her a folder. Lucía opened it with trembling hands. Her heart stopped. They were documents, evidence, suspicious bank accounts, million-dollar transfers, shell companies. Daniela smiled coldly. "Your dear ex-husband and his mother are up to their necks in money laundering." Lucía felt a chill run down her spine. For the first time in a long time, she had something against them, and now it was her turn to attack. Lucía had never believed in miracles. After years of humiliation, of feeling invisible in her own marriage, of being treated like a burden, she had learned that in this world, no one would rescue you. But when Daniela put those documents in front of her, for the first time in a long time, she saw a light. The sheets of paper trembling in her hands were not just papers, they were dynamite. Every transaction, every shell company, every unexplained deposit, everything pointed to the same thing. Carlos and Doña Esperanza were involved in a money laundering scheme that, if discovered, could ruin their lives forever. Lucía looked up and saw the calculating expression on Daniela's face. "Where did you get this?" she asked in a whisper. Daniela smiled coldly. "Let's just say I have contacts who hate your ex-husband as much as you do." Lucía felt a chill run down her spine. "This is enough to destroy them." Daniela held her gaze. "It's enough to make them burn." 2 days before the final verdict, the bomb exploded. It all started with an anonymous leak to the media. California's most important newspaper, El Informador, published a report on its front page. The Alvarez family under suspicion, possible link to money laundering and corporate corruption. Social media exploded. News programs began to talk about the case. Financial analysts questioned the family's banking transactions. People who had previously admired them now pointed to them as thieves. But the worst came when the government intervened. The Alvarez family's bank accounts were frozen. Business partners began to distance themselves. Investments plummeted, and in a matter of days, Carlos and Doña Esperanza went from being untouchable to being under the scrutiny of the justice system. Lucía couldn't help but smile when she saw the news on the television at the taqueria. Carlos and Doña Esperanza hadn't seen this coming, and now they were drowning in their own venom. "You're winning," said Andrés, leaning on the bar. Lucía took a deep breath. There was still a long way to go, because even though everything was pointing in her favor, the most important battle was still to come, the custody trial for Valeria. When Lucía entered the courtroom that day, Carlos no longer had the same confidence as before. His expensive suit was impeccable, but his face betrayed a lack of sleep, worry, and contained rage. And if you want to hear how stories like this one end, and not miss the next one, make sure you subscribe to the channel before we reach the verdict. Doña Esperanza stood rigidly by his side, but her dark eyes shone with fury. She was not used to losing, and now she was losing everything. Carl leaned toward his lawyer and whispered something to him. He seemed desperate. Lucía felt a strange satisfaction. All her life he had been in control. Today, he was not. The judge sat down in his seat and banged his gavel. "We will proceed with the final verdict on the custody of the minor Valeria Alvarez." Lucía felt her breath stop. The judge adjusted his glasses and began to read. After analyzing the evidence presented and evaluating the well-being of the minor, this court determines. The silence in the room was absolute. Carlos clenched his jaw. Doña Esperanza closed her eyes as if praying. Lucía felt her heart stop. Mrs. Lucía Alvarez is granted full and exclusive custody of Valeria Alvarez. For a moment, everything seemed to be in slow motion. Carlos tensed up. Doña Esperanza opened her eyes suddenly. Lucía felt the air return to her lungs. She had won. "This is crazy!" Carlos's voice broke the silence. He stood up suddenly, his face red with fury. "This woman has nothing. I am the one who can give my daughter a future." The judge looked at him sternly. "Mr. Alvarez, if you do not maintain your composure, I will remove you from the courtroom." Carlos clenched his fists. She is going to take her away from me. Lucía stood up calmly and looked him in the eyes. I am not taking her away from you. She was always mine. Carlos seemed about to explode, but then a new voice interrupted him. Mr. Alvarez, we need you to come with us. Everyone turned their head. 2 federal police officers were standing at the entrance to the courtroom. Lucía felt a chill. One of the officers held up a document. We have an arrest warrant against you for alleged fraud and money laundering. Carlos's face fell. Doña Esperanza stood up suddenly. This is a mistake. My son is innocent. The officer remained unmoved. There is also a warrant against you, ma'am. Doña Esperanza was in shock. Carlos looked at Lucía with eyes full of rage. You did this. Lucía looked at him calmly. No, she said in a quiet, confident voice. You did it. The officers handcuffed Carlos as he continued to shout, I'm going to get out of this. I'm going to destroy you, Lucía. Lucía leaned slightly and whispered in his ear, You're already destroyed. Carlos looked at her with pure hatred, but there was nothing he could do. The officers took him out of the room along with his mother. Lucía closed her eyes and took a deep breath. After so long, she was finally free. She turned to Valeria, who was looking at her with wide, frightened eyes. She bent down and picked her up, hugging her tightly. It's all over, my love. Valeria wrapped her little arms around her neck. Now we can be happy. Lucía smiled. Yes, my love. Now we can be happy. But what she didn't know yet was that her story didn't end there. There was one last blow left, one that would change her life forever. Lucía thought that hell had ended the day she saw Carlos and Doña Esperanza being handcuffed and taken out of the courtroom. She thought she could finally breathe, that she could start over, that her life, after so many years of humiliation, had reached a point where there would be no more battles to fight. But she was wrong, because even after winning custody of Valeria, even after seeing them fall, the pain was still there, not only because of what they had done to her, but because she could still hear them in her head. Doña Esperanza's cruel words, Carlos's mocking laughter, the looks of contempt, the constant feeling that she was worthless. 5 years. 5 years of being treated like a piece of furniture. 5 years of being the perfect wife, only to be used, ridiculed, and discarded. 5 years in which they turned her into a nobody. Lucía was free, yes, but she was still not at peace. And this time she would not settle for just winning. She wanted them to pay every last cent. Are you sure about this? Daniela looked at her with a raised eyebrow, holding a thick file on her desk. It's a big lawsuit, Lucía. It won't be a short process, and the Alvarez family still has some allies. Lucía didn't hesitate for a second. I'm going to do it. Daniela studied her for a moment, and then smiled slyly. Okay, then let's destroy them. Lucía's case against Carlos and Doña Esperanza became a media scandal. The newspapers called it the trial of the year. The news covered it every day, and on social media, Lucía's story went viral. Ex-wife of Carlos Alvarez sues him for psychological abuse and defamation. Mother fights for justice after years of abuse. The Alvarez family in freefall. New lawsuit could leave them ruined. Lucía saw the headlines with her heart pounding. Now everyone knew the truth, and this time she had the power. The courtroom was full on the day of the trial. Lucía entered with her head held high. Carlos was sitting in the dock wearing a cheap suit and a hardened expression. He was no longer the arrogant man he used to be. He seemed smaller, more defeated. Doña Esperanza, on the other hand, maintained the same cold expression as always, as if she still believed that she could get out of this. Daniela stood up and walked to the center of the room. Your Honor, we are here because Mrs. Lucía Alvarez was the victim of psychological abuse, manipulation, and defamation during 5 years of marriage. Carlos's lawyer stood up. There is no evidence that my client committed such abuse. This is all an emotional exaggeration. Daniela smiled sidelong. Ah, there is no evidence. She turned her head and looked at Lucía. Lucía, could you tell the court how many times you were humiliated in public by your ex-husband and his mother? Lucía sat up straight in her seat. Too many times to count. Daniela nodded and took a USB drive out of her briefcase. "I would like to present a video as evidence." The judge allowed it. Daniela plugged in the USB drive, and the courtroom screen lit up. Lucía felt a knot in her stomach. It was the recording of the charity gala, the exact moment when Doña Esperanza threw red wine on her. Carlos's laughter, the cruel words, the murmurs of the people, the complete humiliation. The courtroom fell completely silent. The judge looked at Carlos and his mother. "Do you have anything to say about this?" Carlos clenched his jaw. Doña Esperanza didn't even blink. Daniela continued. This was not an isolated incident. It was just one of many. She put more evidence on the table. Emails, messages, testimonies from employees of the Alvarez family confirming the cruel treatment Lucía received. Each document was another nail in the coffin for Carlos and his mother, and for the first time, Lucía saw them cornered. Carlos avoided looking at her. He had nothing to say. Doña Esperanza kept her back straight, but her hands were shaking. "Your Honor, we believe that my client deserves fair compensation for the damages suffered," said Daniela. "We are requesting compensation of 20 million pesos. Carlos's lawyer choked. "That's absurd. You can't ask for that amount." Daniela smiled. "Oh, of course we can, and we're going to win." The judge banged his gavel on the table. "I will review the evidence and give my verdict shortly." Lucía didn't breathe. She sat with her hands clenched on her skirt, feeling that every minute was torture, until the judge spoke again. "This court has reviewed all the evidence and finds that Ms. Lucía Alvarez has been the victim of psychological abuse and defamation." Carlos lowered his head. Doña Esperanza closed her eyes as if trying to contain the blow. Lucía felt a chill. Ms. Alvarez is awarded compensation of 20 million pesos for psychological damages and damage to her image. Carlos gasped. Doña Esperanza opened her eyes wide. Lucía felt a mixture of relief and triumph. She had done it. Carlos slammed his fist on the table in fury. "This is a joke." The judge looked at him sternly. "The only joke here is that you thought you could destroy this woman without consequences." Carlos was in shock. Lucía looked at him one last time. She no longer felt fear. She no longer felt pain. She only felt freedom. She left the courtroom with Valeria by the hand. The sun was shining. The air smelled like a new beginning, and for the first time in her life, Lucía felt complete. She still didn't know what she would do with that money, but she did know one thing. She would never again be the woman that Carlos and Esperanza tried to destroy. That Lucía was dead, and in her place, a new one was being reborn. The rain beat against the window pane with a steady, almost hypnotic cadence. From her new apartment in California, Lucía watched the city lit up under the storm with a cup of hot tea in her hands. The echo of the courtroom still resonated in her head. 20 million pesos. A figure that would have seemed unattainable for the woman who, just a year ago, fled in the early morning with a suitcase and her daughter in her arms. The money was there in her bank account, waiting to be used, but she did not look at it with excitement or greed. She did not see it as a prize. She saw it as justice. Every peso represented a humiliation she had endured. Every cent was a scar on her soul that would never completely heal. The money did not give her back the time she had lost. It did not erase the nights of silent crying, the shame of having been treated like trash, the constant fear she felt every time Carlos looked at her with contempt. But it gave her something more important, an opportunity. Lucía turned and looked at Valeria, who was sleeping peacefully in her bed, hugging her teddy bear. She stroked her hair gently. Now her daughter would never have to depend on anyone but the two of them. They would never be vulnerable again. They would never have to ask permission to be happy again. The first few months were crazy. Lucía had never run a business before, but she knew what she would do with the money. She didn't waste it on luxuries or personal revenge. She invested it in her future. She found a small space in downtown California in an area with constant foot traffic. It was a modest space, made of brick, with a large window overlooking the street. She gave it a simple but meaningful name, Dulces Raíces, sweet roots, because that was what she was doing, putting down roots, starting over. She had no experience in management, but she did have passion. For weeks she spent her days and nights testing recipes, adjusting flavors, perfecting every detail. She remembered the afternoons of her childhood with her grandmother. When the aroma of baked bread filled the house, that warmth in her chest, that feeling of home, was what she wanted to bring to her bakery. Her hands, which had once trembled with fear at Carlos's screams, now trembled with the excitement of needing a new life. But starting over is never easy. In the early days, almost no one came into the bakery. Lucía sat behind the counter watching as people passed by on the street without paying attention to her. She had invested a large part of her money in the premises and supplies. If she didn't start selling soon, everything she had built could fall apart. Fear settled in her chest again. "What if I fail?" she asked Andrés, who visited her almost every day to see how everything was going. He smiled calmly at her. "Then try again." Lucía sighed, but she didn't give up. Attract customers, she began giving out small samples of cookies to passers-by. Some people tried them with suspicion. Others smiled, but it was a little girl who changed everything. Lucía offered her a butter cookie, and the little girl took a bite with an expression of amazement. "Mommy, they're just like Grandma's," she said excitedly. Her curious mother entered the shop and bought 2 boxes. That day, they made their first official sale of dulces raíces. The news spread little by little. Lucía's homemade cookies had something special. People said that every bite reminded them of happy moments from their childhood. Customers began to come more often, then more and more, until one afternoon, everything changed. Lucía was behind the counter when a woman walked in with a notebook in her hand. "Are you Lucía Álvarez?" Lucía felt a chill. She still wasn't used to being recognizing her. "Yes. How can I help you?" The woman smiled. "I'm a journalist for El Informador. I'd love to write an article about your story." Lucía felt a twinge in her stomach. She didn't want people to see her as the woman who suffered, but then she thought of all the women who were still trapped in relationships like hers. She thought of those who were afraid to leave, those who believed they couldn't start over. And then she said, "Okay." The article came out a week later with the title, "From Victim to Businesswoman, the story of Lucía Álvarez and Dulces Raíces." The impact was immediate. Social media was flooded with supportive comments. Women came to the bakery not only to buy, but also to talk to her. Some cried. Others told their own stories. They were all looking for the same thing, hope. Lucía listened to them with her heart in her throat and understood something. Her story was not only hers. It was the story of many, and now she had the power to help them. A year later, Dulces Raíces was no longer just a bakery. It was a symbol. Lucía opened 2 new branches, employing women who, like her, had escaped abusive relationships. She created a support program for single mothers where they were taught baking so they could become independent. Every woman who came to work there was a past version of Lucía, but now they were not alone. Lucía was no longer just the owner of a business. She was the helping hand she had once needed and not found. One afternoon, a young woman entered the bakery as they were closing. Lucía looked at her curiously. "Can I help you?" The girl, about 25 years old, looked down. "I don't know why I'm here." Lucía saw the bruises on her wrist and recognized that pain. She smiled kindly. "Yes, you do, woman." She began to cry. Lucía hugged her without saying a word because she knew exactly how she felt. At that moment, she understood that all her suffering had not been in vain. Every emotional blow, every humiliation, every tear she had shed in silence had led her here. Now she was proof that there is always a way out, that there is always a second chance. Lucía was no longer Carlos Alvarez's wife. She was no longer the broken woman who had escaped in the middle of the night. She was Lucía, the owner of her own life, and finally free. The sweet aroma of cinnamon and vanilla floated in the air as Lucía closed the last box of cookies of the day. The bakery was spotless, the floor shiny, the wooden tables polished, and the display cases full of freshly baked bread. Dulces Raíces was a success. The story of her transformation had inspired hundreds of women, and her business had become more than just a bakery. It was a symbol of resilience. Every person who walked in wasn't just looking for a dessert, they were looking for hope, and Lucía made sure to give it to them. She had created a program for women in vulnerable situations, offering them work and training in baking. Women who, like her, had been trampled on, betrayed, and belittled, but who were now rebuilding their lives. And that was worth more than any revenge. One afternoon, as the sun began to set over California, Andres arrived at the bakery, wearing his usual apron with his sleeves rolled up and his hair slightly disheveled. That man had been by her side from the beginning. "You closed late today," he said in his calm tone, leaning against the doorframe. Lucía smiled. "More and more customers are coming in. It's crazy." Andres nodded with a slight smile, but there was something else in his eyes, something she recognized immediately. Lucía was no longer the same woman she had been before. She was no longer afraid to look him in the eye and see what was there, because now she knew she deserved it. Not just any love, not a love based on manipulation, power, or dependence, but real love. One where she didn't have to shrink to fit into someone else's life. Andres approached slowly. "You did all this, you know." Lucía looked down, but he took her hand gently. "Not just the business. You made yourself again." She felt a lump in her throat, because for the first time she believed his words. No, she didn't need Andres to be strong. She didn't need anyone, but she wanted to be with him. Andres looked at her tenderly but firmly. "I'm not going to ask you to rush, Lucía. I just want you to know that I'm here, not because you need someone to rescue you, but because I love the woman you've become." Lucía felt her heart beat faster. She didn't respond with words. She just moved a little closer, enough for him to understand that her answer had already been given. At that moment, she knew that the past was truly behind her. Carlos and Doña Esperanza no longer meant anything to her. The last news she had heard about them was that their assets had been seized, that their influential contacts had turned their backs on them, and that their days of power were over. Justice. Lucía didn't hate them because hatred was a burden she no longer wanted to carry. She owed them nothing, not a glance, not a thought, nothing, because her life was elsewhere, with her daughter, with her business, with her happiness. For the first time in many years, her heart was free. On the day of the opening of the new Dulces Raíces branch, Valeria ran towards her with open arms. Lucía lifted her up and hugged her tightly. "Mommy, I'm so proud of you." Lucía closed her eyes and smiled, because finally, after so much pain, after so much struggle, she was completely happy. And this time, no one was going to take that away from her. To all the women who live in toxic relationships and feel like there is no way out, you are not alone. The fear that paralyzes you, the voice that convinces you that you can't do it, the feeling that no one will believe you, all of that is a lie. You are strong, stronger than you imagine, no matter how many times they told you that you weren't good enough. You are good enough, no matter how many times they made you feel small. You are immense, no matter how many times they made you believe that without him, you couldn't do it. You can handle all the pain you feel now. It won't last forever. Love doesn't hurt. Love doesn't humiliate. Love doesn't make you cry every night in silence. You deserve more. You deserve to be happy. And believe me, you can start over. It will be difficult. It will hurt. But on the other side of that pain is your freedom. And when you finally look and see the incredible woman you've always been, you'll understand that you never needed anyone else to be complete. The power has always been within you. Now is your time to use it. Get up, walk, live. The world is yours.